You put on clothes this morning without thinking twice. Shirt, pants, shoes. It took maybe 3 minutes. You probably did not look in the mirror for more than a few seconds. You definitely did not ask yourself why. But the real reason humans started wearing clothes has almost nothing to do with keeping warm. And once you understand it, you will never look at what you are wearing the same way again. Here is what most people assume. Early humans were cold. They saw animal skins. They put them on. Problem solved. It is a clean, logical story. It is also almost certainly wrong, or at least deeply incomplete. The real story begins not with temperature. It begins with something far smaller. Something you cannot see with a naked eye. Something that has been quietly living on your body your entire life. Lice. Specifically, a very particular kind of louse. In 2003, a team of researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology made a discovery that permanently changed how scientists think about the origin of clothing. They were studying the DNA of human lice. Not just any lice. They were comparing head lice to body lice. These two insects look almost identical, but they live in completely different places. Head lice cling to hair. Body lice cling to clothing. And that distinction turned out to be one of the most important clues in human prehistory. Here is why it matters. Body lice can only survive if clothing exists. Without fabric or hide to cling to, they have nowhere to lay their eggs, nowhere to live between feedings. If you trace body lice back far enough through their evolutionary history, you would eventually find a moment when they first split off from head lice. And that split would tell you approximately when humans first started wearing enough clothing to support a separate louse population. When the researchers ran the genetic analysis, they found that body lice diverged from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That number stopped the scientific world. Clothing, or at least consistent enough clothing to sustain a new species of parasite, began far earlier than almost anyone had guessed. Your ancestors were dressing themselves long before they left Africa, long before they walked into the cold of Europe or Asia, which means the cold weather explanation has a serious problem. If early humans only started wearing clothes when they moved into colder climates, the louse DNA should tell a much more recent story. But it does not. The lice reveals something older, something that emerged under the African sun, where temperatures were not the primary threat. So what was? Think about what your skin does without any protection. It burns. It bleeds. It gets bitten. It gets infected. In an environment filled with biting insects, thorny vegetation, rocky ground, and intense equatorial sunlight, bare skin is a liability. Anthropologist Ian Gilligan, who spent years studying the relationship between human cognition and clothing at the Australian National University, has argued that the earliest use of hides and plant materials was almost certainly about protection from the immediate physical environment. Not warmth. Protection. Your ancestors were practical. They did not theorize about fashion. They noticed that when they wrapped a hide around their shoulders while walking through dense brush, they came out the other side with fewer cuts. They noticed that sleeping on a skin kept insects off their body through the night. They noticed that their children survived longer when shielded from bites and abrasion. These observations did not require language. They required nothing more than attention and memory. But here is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because at some point, clothing stopped being just protection and started being something else entirely. Consider the timeline again. The louse data puts clothing at somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. But archaeological evidence for what researchers call behavioral modernity, the explosion of symbolic thinking, body decoration, abstract art, and ritual behavior, clusters around the same general period. Ochre body paint at Blombos Cave in South Africa dated to roughly 75,000 years ago. Shell beads strung as jewelry at nefarious crowsiness sites along the South African coast dated to approximately 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. Engraved abstract patterns scratched into ochre blocks, some of the oldest abstract marks ever found. Your ancestors were not just covering their bodies, they were decorating them. And this is where clothing becomes one of the most psychologically significant inventions in human history. Because to decorate your body, you first have to have a concept of your body as something that can be seen. You have to understand that other people are looking at you, that you have an appearance, that your appearance communicates something to others. This is called self-awareness. And clothing is one of the clearest archaeological signals that it existed. Researcher Francesco D'Erico, who has spent decades analyzing early symbolic objects at the University of Bordeaux, has argued that body decoration and clothing belong to the same cognitive revolution. They are expressions of the same leap forward. The moment your ancestor first wrapped the skin around their waist and then thought about how it looked was the moment the human social world became permanently more complex. Because clothing is never neutral. Even today, you know this. You change what you wear depending on who you are going to see. You feel exposed when you are underdressed. You feel powerful when you are wearing exactly the right thing. These feelings are not trivial vanity. They are ancient. They are the direct descendants of a system your ancestors used to communicate status, group membership, reproductive fitness, and social role without saying a single word. Clothing became a language before language was fully formed. Anthropologists have found that in every culture ever documented, clothing and body decoration serve as social signals. Every single one. There are no known human cultures that are entirely naked and also entirely indifferent to bodily appearance. The decorative impulse is universal, which means it is not cultural. It is biological. It is built into the way your brain reads other humans and the way it wants to be read in return. Think about that. The anxiety you feel about what to wear to an important meeting is not a product of modern society. It is a 100,000-year-old social processing system firing exactly as designed. But the story does not end with social signaling, because clothing did one more thing, something that may have changed the course of human history more profoundly than almost any other single invention. It allowed your ancestors to go places they could never have survived otherwise. Here is the physical reality. The human body is extraordinarily sensitive to temperature. Your core temperature operates in a band of roughly 2 degrees Celsius. Drop below it, and you begin to shut down. Rise above it, and your brain starts failing. Without external thermal regulation, you are a tropical animal. Period. You evolved in sub-Saharan Africa under conditions your body is finely tuned for. Move too far north, too far into the cold, and you die. Except you did not die. Your ancestors walked out of Africa and spread across the entire planet. They crossed into Europe during ice ages. They survived the tundra of Central Asia. They made it across land bridges into the frozen north of the Americas. None of this should have been possible for a tropical primate. And yet it happened. Clothing made it possible. The same basic technology your ancestors used to protect their skin from thorns and insects was scaled up and refined into the insulating layer that let them survive in environments where no unclothed primate could last a winter. The hide wraps became sewn furs. The simple coverings became layered systems. And with each refinement, the range of habitable territory expanded. Every square kilometer your ancestors colonized beyond the tropics was only accessible because they were wearing something. Archaeologist Olga Soffer, whose work on prehistoric textiles at the University of Illinois helped reconstruct the sophistication of Upper Paleolithic clothing technology, found evidence that by around 26,000 to 27,000 years ago, humans were not just draping animal skins. They were weaving. They had developed plant fiber textiles. They had needles made of bone with actual eyes, meaning they were sewing fitted garments. This is not primitive survival gear. This is engineering. This is craft. This is technology being refined over thousands of generations because it was survival critical. You are the descendant of every human being who figured out how to stay warm enough to survive the night. There is one more layer to this story, one that tends to surprise people when they hear it. Clothing changed your body, not metaphorically, literally. When your ancestors started wearing clothes, they reduced the selective pressure for body hair. For millions of years, primate body hair was a thermal regulation tool. It trapped heat. It provided insulation. It kept early hominins warm enough to function. But once clothing took over that job, the genetic pressure to maintain dense body hair relaxed. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the populations that relied on clothing for warmth gradually lost the body hair they no longer needed for the same purpose. Your relative nakedness is not the ancestral state. It is the product of technology. You are hairless because your ancestors figured out how to make clothing. You wear clothes partly because you are hairless. It is one of the most elegant feedback loops in human evolutionary history. So tonight, when you get home and change out of whatever you put on this morning, take 1 second to actually look at what you are holding. That shirt, that sweater, that jacket. It is the output of a 100,000-year-old technology. It is a social signal. It is a survival tool. It is one of the reasons your brain works the way it does. One of the reasons you ended up born where you were born. One of the reasons a human species managed to spread across an entire planet that was not designed for it. You put on clothes this morning without thinking twice. But the thing you pulled over your head this morning is the reason you are here at all.